stood in the twilight, the mountains receding, compelled by the notion that everything's breathing. The city behind us was fast asleep. Long gone, no more hold on our hearts. They're gathering wood for the cool of the evening. Together in harmless believing. The moon and the tide and the stirring feeling. So sure we could never change. But all the long road home inside us, all flesh and blood and bone. Divide us, are totally alone. Cascading, and flesh and blood and bone. Invading the look in your eyes when I caught you, resigned to your fate, almost bored, with nothing inside. I would taunt you and push you right down to the floor. Then I would leave you behind. Somehow you're behind me even now, to show how unkind I can be. Intelligent boy, rather charming, and kindly to animals too. No one could believe he would harm you. Right, folks, good evening if there's anybody out there. This is World Book Day, and I hope you're all doing lots of reading and having a wonderful time. And I thought I'd celebrate by reading some extracts from a novel that I had published late last year. The novel's called Jack's Well, and it's for 10 to 14-year-olds or anyone who's ever been an adolescent. Because at the heart of the book is the strange state you find yourself in when you're kind of hitting 13, 14, and you're not quite ready to leave all of childhood behind, but you're also not quite sure where it is you're heading. And our hero in this story is a 14-year-old called Jack Wilde, who has that problem to the power of 10, because not only is he a 14-year-old and he's in a boarding school where there are all the problems that you might have at any school, a bit of bullying, a bit of exclusion, but Jack has the misfortune to be world famous, because when he was 6, his dad wrote a series of stories about him, fantasy stories, in which he's the hero in a wonderful kingdom with a giant Viking warrior friend, and these books sold in their millions. And everybody thinks they know Jack because he is this famous character. Unfortunately, the Jack in the books is always 6 years old, so he doesn't grow up. And the real Jack, poor old Jack, does grow up and has all the struggles that everyone else has growing up, but with this added pressure of being weirdly famous. So the book is a bit of a mishmash. It's got a strange wee cover, as you can see. On the front cover here, there is another book called Jack's Well. And that's because within this story we hear extracts from Jack's dad's books, as Jack reads to us and tells us about how he's recovering from a breakdown that he's had. So he's had a bit of a break from reality at school, at his boarding school, and he's now recovering in a kind of a rest home, a private rest home. So we have his recovery journal, we have extracts from his dad's stories, we also have extracts from an unauthorised biography that a hack journalist has written about him, which he doesn't recognise himself in there at all. And he also has to deal with the fact that there are multi-million-pound movies made from the books, and there's a young actor who plays him, who, in fact, we'll come to that. So I'm going to read you a couple of chapters, folks. The first one is the first chapter from Jack's dad's story. So this is supposed to be within a fictional world that Jack's dad made up when Jack was only 6. And the first book is called Jack's Well. Chapter 1. On an ordinary day, when ordinary sunlight was trickling ordinarily through a layer of ordinary thin white clouds, a little boy was throwing a ball up in the air and catching it for no better reason than to keep himself busy. It was a red ball, not new, and it would have been far more fun to throw it to someone else, but there was no one else around at the time, and so he made the best of it. The boy's name was Jack Wilde, and he was playing in the garden of the house where he lived with his mother and father. The house, like the ball, was not new, but it was cheery and safe, and Jack was very happy there. The best thing about the house was the garden. A wild tangle full of surprises, it bristled with an air of mystery and adventure. Or at least it did sometimes. Today it was as humdrum and dull as a car park. The daylight was flat, the trees were bare, and it was almost, but not quite, too cold to be outdoors. And as usual there was no one to play with. On the plus side, Jack had beaten his personal record for throwing and catching a ball without dropping it. He was at 235, smashing his previous best of 162, and was beginning to think it was time for another record. For example, could he throw the ball higher than the oak tree yet? Jack had fired arrows higher than the tree, but that didn't really count. It had to be a throw. And today, he felt sure, was the day. He eyed the challenge. Wind speed seemed about right. He'd need to stand next to the birdbath to get the right angle of attack. No, hang on, that would send the ball right over the tree and into the wood beyond, and he'd probably never see it again. He had to stand in the rockery and aim high. A sharp angle, that was it. He took his position and closed his eyes, breathed in deeply through his nostrils, exhaled noisily through his mouth, slightly bent the knees. Balance was key. He jostled the ball about in the palm of his hand, really getting the feel of the thing, its shape and weight. Then he reached back with his right hand, pointed his left straight up in the direction he wanted the ball to travel, and with a bellow worthy of an Olympic javelin thrower, he catapulted the little red sphere high into the white, chilly sky. Up and up it sailed, shooting past the creaking lower branches of the oak tree, up past the gnarled woody mass on the trunk that looked a bit like a face, past the white scar where a winter gale had taken down an old dead branch, and out into the open sky above. "Yes!" shouted Jack, punching the air in triumph. "Woohoo! Take that!" He did a joyful war dance, twirling and spinning on the lawn before flopping delightedly on his back and laughing up into the sky he had so effortlessly conquered. Sploosh. Eh? Sploosh? Okay, what goes up must come down, and the ball had clearly landed, but never before in Jack's long throwing career had the ball landed with a sploosh. A thud, yes. A crack. A snapping, popping autumnal kerswish, perhaps on a wet day with a squish or a gloop, and if he was particularly unlucky, as he had been on one memorable occasion, with the shattering tinkle of glass. But there was nothing in the garden, the wood, or the street at the front which could possibly make a sploosh, as far as he knew. Jack sat up and peered around. The mysterious sound had come from near the oak tree, from behind its ancient trunk, in fact. At the base of the tree there was such a tangle of roots, ivy, and rust-coloured leaves that the ground had long since disappeared beneath him, but Jack had never had any reason to think there was anything other than the same musty earth under there as could be found all over the rest of the garden. But that was definitely where the mysterious sploosh had come from. He got up and glanced around. If he was about to make a fascinating discovery, he was fairly sure he didn't want anyone to see. Jack loved his parents, but they did have the annoying habit of getting in the way of true discovery, and he couldn't help but feel they might be more interested in how dirty his clothes would get in the undergrowth than in the existence of a mysterious pool of water. He glanced up at the windows. Nothing. They must be busy. Cautiously, Jack padded across the spongy grass and into the lowering shade of the tree. One huge root snaked out into the lawn, a frozen lava flow of gnarled and knotted wood. Jack hopped up onto it. Placing a hand on the rough bark of the trunk for balance, he peered into the dark green beyond. Nothing immediately leapt to view, but he had the niggling sense that something was peculiar. There was the skeletal remnant of an old scooter poking up through the ivy, but that was nothing new. The scatter of white splashes underneath the starling roost had always been there, but something was different, not at ground level though, up. Jack peered up through the gloom at the underside of a broad, low bough. At first he couldn't make sense of what he was looking at. Playing across the surface of the tree was a sparkling, shifting pattern, endlessly changing as lines of light crossed and glinted and danced around each other. Then it came to him. It was the same pattern he could see on the ceiling of the swimming pool when he was floating on his back. Water, or at least light reflecting off water. So the sploosh must have come from down there. He hopped off the root and into the tangled ivy, dry and crunchy as cornflakes. The ivy pushed his trouser leg up to his calves, and the twigs and branches jabbed at the exposed skin, but he barely noticed. Carefully, choosing every step, he picked his way to the point from which the watery dazzle seemed to be coming. There was no sign at all of anything unusual until he was directly above it, and then Jack caught his breath. A perfectly circular hole, as if drilled through the undergrowth and ground, and down that hole a glittering light or something. Suddenly the ground gave way beneath him, and he dropped feet first down the startlingly enlarged hole. Before he even had time to scream, he had plunged into deep, icy water, submerging completely before frantically clawing his way back to the surface. He couldn't tell how deep the water was, but his feet certainly hadn't touched anything solid, and he was now floundering desperately, trying to find a handhold. Dust and soil were showering down from above him with a sound like an April rainstorm, stinging his eyes and catching in his throat, and his body was racked with a coughing fit, which threatened to fill his lungs with water as it doubled him over. His clothes, swamped and clinging, felt as heavy as chainmail and seemed fit to drag him back under water when, without even realising it had happened, Jack closed a hand tight round a trailing stem of ivy and clung on for dear life while the spluttering and coughing subsided. As the last of the grit from above pattered down around him, leaving only swirling dust particles in the dim light, Jack began to take stock of his situation. Although his heart was racing and his chest was burning after struggling for breath, he was at least no longer in immediate danger of drowning. Being as tough and hardy as only a 6-year-old boy can be, he didn't really have time to be scared. There was too much to discover. His situation, while uncomfortable, was intriguing in the extreme. He appeared to be in a perfectly circular hole with shining, smooth sides broken only by the trailing ivy. The space was lit by an eerie glow. This must have cast the reflection up onto the tree. But the strange thing was that looking up, Jack could barely see the sky through the branches, and the bit he could see was still grey and overcast, nowhere near bright enough to cause this sparkling reflection. "So where is the light coming from?" he asked himself aloud. Looking down, he found his question answered. The light was not reflected. It was shining up through the water, lighting the walls, Jack's ball, oh good, there it is, and Jack himself. There was no doubt about it. This was very strange indeed. Now, I don't know what you would do in this kind of situation. Perhaps you would climb up the ivy and go and get some dry clothes on before telling your mum and dad. But Jack Wilde was not that sort of a boy. He spent less than a second considering his options, took a deep breath, and dived down beneath the icy surface of the water to discover what was glowing at the bottom of this mysterious well. Okay, so that's the first chapter of Jack's dad's book, and young 6-year-old Jack goes right down through this well, and it turns out to be a portal into another world, into the kingdom. A little like the wardrobe in the Narnia books, I guess. There are lots of portals in children's books, as you'll no doubt know. So he finds a kingdom which is ruled by a mysterious king who hasn't been seen for a long time, and seems to be controlled by a sorceress called Lady Blackthorn. And Jack meets a huge warrior called Ulrich, who's based on a doll that his mum got him when he was wee, a Viking doll that she got from York, and befriends him and has various adventures with him. And that's the source of Jack's dad's fortune and fame, and of course Jack's unwanted fame as well. But this is not that book. That's an extract from the book. This is Jack's recovery journal, so we also get to hear from 14-year-old Jack himself. So I'm going to skip to a chapter where Jack, the real Jack, is telling us a little bit about his own life. And it hasn't been that easy a life, because his parents haven't always gotten along, and, well, I'll read you this wee extract. This is Jack's journal, chapter 15. Speaking of mothers, back in the good old days, I was often called a daddy's boy. Aye, he's his father's son, wise relatives would announce, patting me on the head indulgently, and I'd think, well, of course. Dad was the fun one. Dad made up stories. He took me places. He carried me on his shoulders on forest walks. He taught me stuff. He read me all the books he'd enjoyed himself as a child. What did Mum do? Well, gosh, I could barely even say. But when she left, it became very clear what she had done. She had done everything. Dad may have added the occasional splash of colour, but all the bold, clear lines of my life, they were entirely drawn by her. So suddenly, overnight, I no longer knew when my mealtimes were, what clothes I would have in my drawer, which friends I could ask to come round. I didn't know if or when I would get pocket money, couldn't say who had given me which present for my birthday. I couldn't say where my toys were, didn't know which cupboards to find things in, couldn't be sure of finding a clean glass when I was thirsty. But more than that, much more, I just couldn't be sure in the same constant, consistent way, which I'd so much taken for granted, that I was always cared for by someone. You know, no one checked if I had done my homework. I had hated doing homework, but the fact that I could get away with not bothering made me indescribably sad. She wrote, of course, and phoned and visited, but there were now limits on something which had been unlimited, barriers between me and something which had once also been me. Dad stayed Dad, and all the precious things he had contributed stayed as a kind of consolation prize, but it was like the icing without the cake, the chorus without the verses or the beat, the cover illustration with no book inside. I was 8 now, but Jack Wilde was still 6. Jack Wilde will always be 6. So those are wee short chapters, these bits with Jack's journal. And we'd like to read you another one of those, from a little bit further on in the book. So Jack's dad has become incredibly famous and wealthy, and he's spent some of this wealth on sending Jack to a boarding school, which is meant to be a great private school, but he doesn't fit in well at all. He doesn't make friends, folk are a bit critical of him, and there's a particularly unpleasant bully there called Alex Smythe-Ashbury, who has a little group of friends and who's from a very wealthy family and takes against Jack for some reason. And so even though he's tried to be friendly and pleasant to the people, he's just never managed to hit it off with anyone, and so he's terribly lonely and isolated there. Okay. The first film came out during my first term at St. Benedict's, I think shortly after Dad started the third book. There was a ridiculous fanfare as if a children's book had never been made into a movie before, and the brand new star of the nation was Connor Ferguson, who had been chosen from thousands of applicants to play, well, me. Even though the books had sold by the bucket load with their proud 6-year-old hero, the movie producers kind of chickened out of having such a young character, so they tweaked the script to make me 8. This meant they could choose 11-year-old Connor, who was small but gifted for his age, to put in a decent turn as the brave young hero, and he stood up to Madame Blackthorn and the Black Monks very well. In interviews and magazines and on TV, Connor seemed to be a very confident kid, deeply honoured and humbled to be in such a super movie. He was always smiling, I remember, and it was hard not to imagine him being incredibly smug, though the national press didn't say so. I accidentally caught a profile of him on Newsround one day, and it was very weird hearing him introduced as Jack Wilde, while being so spectacularly unlike me. Of course, the film broke some box office record or another and became a British success story overnight. Maddeningly, the mania which surrounded it completely extended to my schoolfellows. Posters, pencil cases, mugs and all that stuff appeared in the form rooms and the dormitories, and people played Jack's Well games in the playground. Was I ever included? Nope. I hadn't made a single friend. Some of the boys were all right, but they just weren't interested. If I tried to be confident, Alex made sure everyone saw me as a pushy bully trying to boss everyone around. If I made any effort to be friendly, Alex made fun of me sucking up to people and warned them not to bother with me. I was the butt of jokes in the dormitory, pushed and tripped in the corridor, and generally completely ignored in the playground. Sorry, the quadrangle. Then 2 things happened at once. First of all, someone, and I'd love to blame Alex, but it could have been any one of a number of boys, made a fake Facebook page in my name. They friended all the older boys who had accounts, then started writing horrible things about people as me. It was unbelievably crude, some of the stuff they wrote, and if anyone at the school had known me, they would have known I couldn't write that sort of thing. But no one did know me, so for a while people really thought it was me doing it. I knew nothing about it at first because I didn't have a tablet and hadn't got into Facebook. I only found out when a prefect came up to me red-faced in the corridor and told me if I didn't stop chatting him up online, he would break my jaw. Alex and his mates were passing at the time, and they burst into snotters of laughter, so I eventually put 2 and 2 together. The only sort of positive thing that came out of this was that I finally got onto Facebook and found that there were dozens of pages dedicated to me in the most glowing, friendly and supportive terms. Even that was a bit weird though. The best ones said they were fan pages, but at least 3 others claimed to actually be me. While this was going on and I was feeling totally rejected and alone, there was a new arrival at school. Can you guess who it was? Can you guess who swanned into a ready-made fan base, who accepted his popularity as if it were the most natural thing in the world, who was bafflingly welcomed into Alex's inner circle on his very first day? Why, Jack Wilde himself, of course. Connor Bloody Ferguson, in all his shiny, fluty-voiced glory. So poor old Jack is presented with all these different versions of himself every single day at the time in your life when you're really not sure who you are anyway. And this is actually based on some real-life people. So I don't know if you know the stories of Winnie the Pooh and Christopher Robin. Christopher Robin was a real boy. He was A.A. Milne's son. And the stories were made up for him when he was young. But of course, as he grew up, the character in the stories didn't grow up exactly like Jack. And he really struggled in life to be taken seriously because everyone knew him as this wee boy in his welly boots with his toy bear and his talking teddies. And it was a source of real difficulty for him, and he was the victim of bullying at school and things like that and had to overcome all the sorts of things that Jack overcomes in this book. But of course, in an age before social media when you can't just shut the door on what the world has to say about you, and Jack has to put up with all that as well. And if I've still got you with me, folks, then I'm going to read you one last chapter, and this is another excerpt from one of Jack's dad's books. So we're going back into the fantasy world of the kingdom, and we will see what's happening there. The different books, by the way, are in different fonts within the story, so you can tell which bit you're reading, if it's an extract from Jack's diary, or from the books, or from anything else, any of the other narrative threads that we've got going on. So this is from Jack's dad's second book, The Black Desert. Jack and Ulrich thundered across the grassy plain on their red-eyed horses, startling birds up into the sky and leaving a rising dust trail behind them. Jack, who had never ridden before his arrival in the kingdom, had been practising hard under Ulrich's expert eye, and was now so at home on horseback that he could hardly believe he hadn't been doing it all his life. It felt incredible. The warm wind in his face as they pounded along, the muscular power of the animal beneath him, and the wide, wild freedom of the open plain. "This is great!" he shouted to Ulrich, who turned his great bearded face towards him and grinned. "You're doing well, young Jack," he bellowed in reply. "I could have used you at my side in happier days." Jack thought his heart would burst with pride, and he spurred his horse on even faster in sheer joy. Up ahead, the sun glinted off shallow marshland, and the horses sent up curtains of spray as they galloped through the water. They were heading back to the place where Jack had first emerged from the pool of the vanishing, what seemed like a lifetime ago, a place that neither he nor Ulrich had returned to since. Jack had always had a secret fear that the huge warrior would try to persuade him to return through the water to his own world, but an even greater fear that he would want to do it himself. Although life had become one long adventure, Jack couldn't help wondering how much time had passed back home, and how his mum and dad were doing. But today's expedition was not about him. Today's expedition was part of Ulrich's continued teachings about the dreaded malataxia. As shocking as Jack found it, his friend had a theory that malataxia was not, as she claimed, a visitor from beyond the Black Desert, but a woman from Jack's own world. It was this suspicion that had brought Ulrich and his men to the Pool of the Vanishing on the fateful day when they'd found Jack himself. Ulrich and his men had been in the middle of a secret investigation into Malataxia's true identity, which was rather interrupted by Jack's unexpected appearance. Now that Madame Blackthorn had been defeated, and Ulrich had more freedom within the kingdom, he was impatient to continue his search for the truth. And if the search for truth meant galloping through the rolling plains on a beautiful day, Jack was more than happy to come along for the ride. Suddenly, both horses pounded to a halt, almost throwing their riders from their backs, and began rearing and whinnying in the greatest agitation. They were still in the shallow marsh, and the horses' agitation was churning and boiling the glistening waters. Jack shouted in alarm and held on for dear life as Ulrich stood in his stirrups and urgently growled words in some incomprehensible language. He held his reins in one hand and stroked his steed's straining neck with the other, and slowly but surely the animals began to calm down. As soon as it was safe to do so, Ulrich leapt from his saddle, landing with a mighty splash, and pulled Jack to safety away from his own frightened animal. The horses immediately turned and galloped off some distance through the sparkling spray, stopping only when they had reached the edge of the marshland, where they snorted and kicked the dust impatiently. Ulrich lifted Jack onto his shoulders, his great furred jerkin providing a more comfortable seat than the hard leather saddle had been. "What made them do that?" asked Jack breathlessly, his heart still pounding from the shock. "I do not know," replied Ulrich, "but I fear." Jack sensed the big man tensing up in preparation for danger. Not wishing to make things harder for his friend, he said, "I don't mind getting my feet wet, you know." "I am sure you do not, young Jack," rumbled Ulrich in reply. "That is not why I have placed you up there." He tilted his head so he could cast one twinkling eye up at Jack. "I need you to be my lookout." "Lookout?" asked Jack, startled. "Lookout for what?" "Just keep your eyes on the marshland and tell me if you see any movement." She might have guessed. Jack held on to the warrior's head as Ulrich scanned distractedly left and right. Deciding it was no time to disturb his friend with questions, he obediently followed suit and peered this way and that, though still not sure what he was looking for. The marsh stretched around them, glittering in the sunlight, and Jack had to shade his eyes from the glare. The tall reeds waved gently in the warm breeze, shaking here and there when one of the small brown marsh birds landed or took off. Jack pointed this out to Ulrich every time he saw one, but this was clearly not what he was supposed to be watching for. And then Jack knew that the day had changed. The breeze still blew, but it was cold now and hard, and the sunlight reflected in the water was neither cheering nor comforting, but harsh and unrelenting. A cold chill ran down Jack's back, and in the corner of his eye he thought he saw shapes slithering through the reeds towards them. He looked at the spot but saw nothing. But then there, from the opposite direction, another black shape emerged, sliding towards them like an eel or a snake. Ulrich, something's coming. I think they're animals of some kind. Long, black animals. Beneath him, Ulrich froze and muttered something under his breath. What is it? Jack asked. What are they? Stay perfectly still, Jack, replied Ulrich, and Jack had never heard his voice sound so urgent. She must have known we would come. I was afraid of this. The shapes drew closer, closing in from all directions now like a cold black tide. But what are they? Jack was ready for anything except the thought that Ulrich might be afraid. That was the single most frightening idea he could imagine. Whatever these creatures were, they must be truly terrible, for when Ulrich replied there was a note of cold defeat in his voice, and Jack almost cried to hear it. Crawlers, muttered the warrior. She has sent the crawlers. And if you want to find out what the crawlers are, or anything else about this fascinating book, then I suggest that you buy a copy. I would be delighted if you would. It's available from all good bookshops, and all terrible bookshops too. If you do decide to buy one from Amazon, may I suggest that you also look to see if you can support the movement for the Amazon workers to create their own trade union, which is what I will certainly be doing. Otherwise, it's available from my publisher and from any other online bookseller. And if you do pick up a copy, I would love to hear what you think of it. I'm very proud of it. I think it all the different threads do come together at the end, which was a bit of a juggling trick, and I hope if you do pick up a copy, you will appreciate that. But thanks very much for joining me this evening, or at any point that you've watched this video that's not this evening, and I hope to catch up with you all in the real world very soon indeed. Thanks very much, folks. Enjoy the rest of your World Book Day. All the best. Bye-bye.